Welcome to another episode of Village Media's Up Close and Personal. I'm Scott Sexsmith. For decades, today's guest was welcomed into our living rooms 5 nights a week to bring us up to speed on the day that was. I'm pleased to welcome to the show the former anchor and chief correspondent of the National on CBC, Peter Mansbridge. Peter, welcome to Up Close and Personal. Terrific to have you here today.
Hey, Scott, it's great to be with you.
Now, when you hear that it was almost 30 years on the anchor desk, did it seem like it was that long to you, or was it like a lot of careers where you blink and it's done?
Probably the latter. Because you're dealing with so many kind of mind-bending stories as we were, it did go by in a flash. I mean, I was at the CBC for 50 years, 20 years as a reporter, and then the last 30 as the anchor. And really, it didn't feel like 50 years when I left. There was so much fun. There were so many good people that I worked with, and there were so many big stories that I found myself involved with. That no day was boring. They were all exciting.
Yeah, I bet. Lots of things today, Peter, that I'd like to cover. Obviously, your career and the many historic things that you've seen and covered. Your daily podcast, The Bridge, that's available wherever people get their favorite podcasts, and of course on Sirius XM. I'd like to start, though, if we can, with family. And both your dad and grandfather served in the military, as you did for a couple of years, and then in 1966 left. So it could have been a much different path for you.
It could have been. I didn't have the distinguished military service that my father or my grandfather had. My grandfather was in the Canadian Army. He fought at Vimy Ridge, among other places. My dad was in the RAF, the Royal Air Force.
Right.
We were from Britain, and he had a distinguished career in the RAF and won the DFC, pinned on him by the King at the time in Buckingham Palace. Mine was a much shorter stint. I was in the Navy, in the Royal Canadian Navy. Went in '66, was out by late '67, but I had a great time. I was in flying training. I was stationed in Esquimalt, BC, and Camp Borden, Ontario, and Portage Prairie, Manitoba. So I got around in a short period of time. Did single engine aircraft and multi-engine aircraft in my time. But it wasn't quite good enough. They thought, I don't think we can risk this guy on the Bonaventure, which was our aircraft carrier at the time. The only one, the last one we had. But I made a lot of good friends who are still friends that I see every once in a while in the Navy. Most of them ended up going after their Navy time, flying for Air Canada or other commercial airlines. So they're all good.
I love the story, Peter, of how your career started, or at least how you were discovered, working for Transair at the Churchill Airport in Churchill, Manitoba. And after hearing you make a flight announcement, you were, I believe, recruited and hired by a CBC radio station manager by the name of Gaston Charpentier. Do you recall that? Do you recall what the announcement was that you made that
I
led
do. I remember it exactly. Transair Flight 106 for Thompson the Pond, Winnipeg, is now ready for boarding at Gate 1. We only had one gate in Churchill. It sounded like the right thing to say. And Gaston happened to be in the terminal building that day, and he was desperate to find someone to work the late shift because he couldn't find anyone. He'd offered it to a number of people. And he came over to me, just like I'm sure he would have come over the next voice he'd heard, and said, hey, would you be interested in doing this? You've got a good voice for radio. And I said, sure, absolutely. And so for the next year, I worked both at Transair. I mean, I was 19,
right? Both
at Transair and at CBC at night. And, there was no to be honest, there was not a lot to do in Churchill in those days. So working was not a bad idea. But that's how I started, and journalism students today look at me like I'm got two heads when I tell that story because it doesn't seem fair to them. And it probably isn't. I mean, I hadn't finished high school. I'd never gone to university. And here I was suddenly, holding down a CBC job that launched me on a career.
It did, and you worked radio for a few years. Then I think it was in 1972 you crossed over to the TV side of the business. Could you ever have imagined that things would have turned out the way that it did, looking back?
When I first started and I first got behind a microphone and I first started talking and ad-libbing, I thought, man, this is great, but sooner or later they're going to catch up to me. And and I kept expecting that throughout my career, that someday somebody was going to knock on the door and say, you know what, we made a mistake. We were supposed to have checked. The human resources people were supposed to have checked this, that, or the other thing, and you actually don't qualify. But that never happened. And the further I went, the more ambitious I got, and the harder I worked. And I by the time I left Churchill, I had a plan in my head. I didn't share it with anybody else, but I had a plan in my head that I wanted the top job. I wanted to be the anchor of the National, and it seemed extremely far-fetched, and it was for somebody to be thinking that way at that time. But that was the career path I set myself on, and achieved all my goals. Some on the time schedule I was looking at, others it took me longer, but eventually I got there. And in 20 years, I was anchoring the National.
But you're right, though. It's about goal setting, and even as extreme as they may seem, it certainly proves how important they are to have.
Absolutely. I'm a big believer in setting goals and being realistic about them. You're not always going to make the time period you set for things, and you've got to adapt to those kind of changes and to those kind of setbacks. And that's and that's not a problem. You learn from your setbacks. So I always I set goals, and I believed in them, and I believed in myself. And, over times I can remember when I graduated from local reporting to network reporting, it took me 3 sessions to get that. We call them boards at the CBC, where you apply for a job, and if you're on the short list, you go to a board. And I had 3 of them where I lost. And for others, they would have given up. I didn't. I said, this is okay. I'll learn from that setback, and I'll be better the next time around. And I always told that story to young kids who would come to my office, young journalists who would come to my office, who were all depressed about not getting a particular job and wanting to quit and go into whatever, marketing or advertising or something. I said, no, come on. That's just one. That's just your first shot. Sometimes you're going to make it on your first shot. Other times it's going to take more than that. And that was my belief. And I think I managed to turn a few other people into that same belief.
So even now that you're retired from that part of your life, is goal setting still something that, is it now about I want to hit so many subscribers or downloads of the Bridge, or what do goals or objectives look like to Peter Mansbridge today?
When I started my podcast, Scott, it was really, I wasn't looking for a job. My son actually kind of pushed me into it, said, you should do something. It's keep your mind active and blah, blah, blah. And it's easy, and you don't need a lot of equipment. And so I started it as a hobby. And I had no intention of selling it or making money out of it. But it became successful for some strange reason. And then a bidding war started from a number of different places, which Sirius XM ended up winning. And so now I actually make money out of it. I don't know how long I'm going to be doing it. I signed a 3-year contract with Sirius a couple of years ago. So it's not going to go on forever. We have, Cynthia, my wife, and I have other things that we do, including we have a home in Scotland where we spend a fair amount of time there. I can do the podcast from there. I mean, as you know, in today's world, you can be anywhere.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter where you are. And so I do that. But I also, Simon and Schuster came to me a couple of years ago and said, you should really write a book. And I said, no, I don't have the patience to do that. So here we are 3 books later, and
right.
All bestsellers. So I'm in the midst of writing another one right now.
Okay. So after stints in Saskatchewan and Ottawa, you became the substitute fill-in anchor for Knowlton Nash, another legend in Canadian broadcasting on the National. Peter, can you describe the first time that you sat in that chair and what went through your mind? Were you nervous? What were you feeling?
I was certainly nervous. I mean, I'd grown up. We moved to Canada in the kind of mid '50s, and we grew up watching the CBC and listening to the CBC, and so I knew knew the names of all the anchors who had done the national news. Whether it initially used to be in the early evening around 6:30, and then it eventually became 11 o'clock, and then 10 o'clock. So suddenly there I was sitting in the chair. It was a Saturday night. And, excuse me, I was definitely nervous. I was convinced that if anybody was watching me, they could see my heart pounding through my jacket, But I managed to get through it. I mean, I was nervous because of, the weight of that program,
right.
In terms of, it was the original network newscast in Canada, and it had been so much a part of my life. And then suddenly, this high school dropout baggage handler from Churchill, Manitoba, was sitting there reading the news. And I had those moments, throughout my career, sitting across from, President Obama in the White House, or the Dalai Lama, or Desmond Tutu, or, various prime ministers and presidents of countries around the world, not to mention, our own, where I would kind of pinch myself and say, this is really something. What am I doing here, right?
So in 1988, I think that's when you became the permanent anchor of the National, but you were offered an opportunity to go stateside by CBS, I believe. What was that opportunity, and ultimately what made you decide to stay in Canada?
Well, a lot of Canadians, as you know, have made that move south as reporters and as anchors. Peter Jennings, who grew up in the same town I did in Canada in terms of Ottawa, had done very successful moves to the States. CBS came after me in that year in '88. They wanted to totally revamp their morning television show, which they seem to have tried like 50 times at least. But they had an idea to do it that way, and they wanted me to be the host, the male host. There were two hosts.
Mm-hmm.
And I went through the process. At that point, I was the weekend anchor, and I was going to go. It was a great opportunity, and it was, bags of money, as the Americans tend to do. And then Knowlton sort of got in the way. He called me up and he said, you don't want to do this, and I don't want you to do it, and I want you to stay. And I was already thinking of retiring because I want to write books. And so that's what happened. And I stayed. Some people couldn't believe it because it was a considerable amount of money, but it wasn't as if the CBC was offering nothing,
Right, yeah.
They were offering a pretty good package, which I still have the benefits of today. So that's what happened. I still have a lot of friends in the States, both at the journalistic level and on the management level, and I hear from them, every once in a while, but getting advice on this, that, or the other thing. So there's no harm done. The one thing about the Americans, if you say no to them, they just want you more.
And tend to offer more money.
How good you are. Right. It doesn't matter how good you are. They assume, wow, he must be really good. He said no.
That's right. So, Peter, back when you first started out, and I guess for years after that, when a big story would break, you would have, in some cases, hours to prepare. Now we get our news so fast; it's instantaneous. Obviously, thanks in large part to social media. Is it a case of too much, too fast, or is it just part of evolution, and we need to adapt and embrace that?
A little of both. Stuff does move very quickly now, and as a result, your anchors, your front people, the men and women of television news have got to be kind of prepared on a lot of fronts before things happen. They got to understand certain issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's nuclear issues, whether it's a conflict of a different kind. Um, Obviously, parliamentary issues that pop up. There has to be a grounding there. You don't need to be an expert, but you need enough knowledge that you can have a basic understanding of certain issues and be able to ask questions to further that understanding. And you can see those who are not ready for prime time, so to speak, pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And you end up moving around the channels to find somebody who you do have some faith and trust in. But listen, technology is a wonderful thing. I mean, what were the advances we've seen? When I started, I know it's ancient history to most people, but when I started in 68, it was black and white television.
Right.
It was film. You physically had to cut the film and stick pieces together to make a story. And you had, as you said, a couple of hours to decide what you were going to say because the film was in a lab being processed. So where are we after those years where, film is ancient, doesn't happen anymore? Even in documentary work, they don't use film anymore, a lot of it. And we're well past the 500 channel universe. We're into streaming. We're into this, that, or the other thing. The total television landscape has changed. But when the crisis hits, when the 9/11 happens, when the big hurricane hits, the war starts, whatever the story is, you depend on information provided to you by a trusted source. And while technology will help you see and get that information fast, you still need the human element to make it understandable and informative and allow you, in many ways, to make up your own mind about what it is you're seeing or feeling. So that part of it never changes. The quality of storytelling never changes. It's such a critical, important part of journalism. It's great storytelling, and some of that has been lost in the rapid advancement of technology.
Yeah, and that's a great point that I wanted to build on. You talk about trusted sources, and when you look at the state of journalism today and what some would call that lack of faith and trust in the media, even the mainstream media, what do you think has caused this, and do you think there's a way for media to fix this mistrust that seems to exist?
Well, there's no doubt it does exist. It's more than seems to. It does exist. There is not that long ago when Canadians were asked, do you trust the media? Do you trust your major sources of media? The number would come in around the high 70s, sometimes even the low 80s. It was pretty good. It was up there with doctors and nurses and firefighters and that kind of thing. Well, now, we're down with politicians, right? Not to slag politicians, because I try not to, but they have a much harder time winning the trust of the electorate. And in our case, we have a lot of trouble right now earning the trust of our audiences, viewers, listeners, readers, what have you. And that's because there's been some bad journalism out there. The rapid expansion of journalism to so many different sources has left everybody lumping the media into one pot.
Right.
Whether it's social media or Facebook or, what have you, or traditional television networks or newspapers. When in fact, there are differences. But nevertheless, the trust factor has affected everybody. And when you look for solutions, I'm not sure there are any number. I look to more transparency on the part of the media. We have to do a better job of explaining how we do our job. When you look at a television newscast, well, what went into making the decision that story is the top story, or that story warranted 5 minutes of coverage and another story either didn't warrant any or warranted only 1 minute? Or what makes you decide on a lineup? What makes you give certain sources anonymity and others not? I mean, these things are kind of basic, and we see them as basic and don't even think about them. But our audience is asking more and more questions these days about the decisions we make. And we have to get ahead of that by offering it up. We also have, if we make a mistake, you got to say it. You know, I, I was lucky in my 30 years. I don't think we made any big mistakes, um, more than you could count on the fingers of one hand.
Right.
But when we did, we made a big deal about explaining what went wrong and why it went wrong, and apologizing. Um, but there are lots of little things that happen in any journalist's day, in terms of what they end up reporting, that might not be 100% accurate when that they later find out. And it may seem small to that journalist or to that news organization, but I'm a big believer in being transparent, saying, listen, in the story we reported yesterday on such and such, everything about it was right except this one element, and we want to correct it now. And, you give the correction. And all that does, the fear is, oh my God, we're going to lose an audience because, we made a mistake. No, you're going to gain an audience because they say, man, if they're going to apologize for a little thing like that, they're definitely going to be extremely careful about how they handle these stories, whatever the stories may be. And, it helps you. It makes you look more human on the one hand and more responsible on the other hand.
Absolutely. A bit of a segue into my next question, Peter, and it surrounds local journalism. And it's kind of what we hang our hats on here at Village Media. In fact, your hometown, we operate stratfordtoday.ca, which is one of 18 local news websites that we have across the province. In your opinion, how important is local journalism, and what does it mean to communities like Stratford and others to have those kinds of outlets?
Keep in mind, you're talking to a guy who started in Churchill, Manitoba, right? Thousands of people on a good day. And it was I was the only, we didn't even have a newscast when I started. And they wanted me to play records, which I was terrible at. So I pushed to start a newscast. And it was all local, right? I mean, Churchill, you have wonderful stories like polar bears and things like that.
Right.
But most of it was covering the town council, covering the school board, covering the various issues and concerns that average people have. Their schools, their sewer, their water, their roads, what have you. Those are critical to any success on a community level anywhere. And if you don't have journalists asking the questions and reporting what they get as answers, you're going to have an ill-informed public. I can, one of my friends here in Stratford is Dan Matheson. He's the local mayor, has been for like 20 years. He's not running this time around, which is unfortunate for Stratford. But nevertheless, I asked him one day, when this was a couple of years ago, when there was kind of a shakeup in the local media structure and the amount of local reporting that was going on. I said, how's that impacting town? He says, council meetings every, whatever it is, Tuesday night, and there are no journalists there. And what that has led to is that there are no citizens there.
Right.
People aren't informed, and therefore they're not asking questions, or they don't know where to go to ask questions. And that's not good. That's not good for community. It's not good for democracy. It's obviously not good for, journalism. So how important is local? It means everything. I get consumed by talking about things that happen on Parliament Hill. Well, they're important, but they're not as important to my neighbor as the street outside the door, or the sewer, the water, the local taxes, the schools that his kids go to. That's what's important. And you get that through local coverage. So, I applaud operations like yours that ensure that local coverage is still there.
Speaking of Stratford, and you and I talked about this before we started taping today, what are the odds that the two biggest names in television journalism in our country, of course, yourself and Lloyd Robertson are both from there? It's uncanny, really, when you think about it.
It is uncanny. I mean, Lloyd was born just around the corner from where we live now. I didn't grow up in Stratford. We've been here 20 years. My wife has been part of the Stratford Festival at times. But Lloyd, was born here, grew up here, went to school here, played sports here, worked at the local radio station, and that launched his whole time. So he is like a classic local hero. He comes back a lot. He does all kinds of charitable things here in Stratford. But every once in a while, when he's back in town, we'll go for lunch or something, and people will go. They'll stick us in the table at the front of the restaurant, right, in front of the window, right? And people go by and go, "Really? Was like Lloyd Robertson and Peter Mansbridge?" So we get a kick out of that.
We had Lloyd on the show a couple of months back, and I asked him what events that he had covered stood out to him. And he said really his career was kind of bookended by the two biggest being the assassination of JFK and 9/11. In your case, you've witnessed and been the storyteller to Canadians of countless events as well. What has stood out for you or was memorable that you had a front row seat for?
Well, it's funny because when you're the anchor, you're kind of tied down to the studio. So you have a front row seat in the sense that you've got a live feed coming in, but you don't have a front row sense that you're actually at the event. So it was one of the things, because I'd been a reporter for 20 years and had traveled the world and the country, the argument that I made, the deal I made with the CBC when I took over the National was that I wanted the show to travel as often as we could. It's expensive to do that, less so now than it was then. But they agreed to that. So I was able to get to a lot of places, and one of the big ones for me, I mean, I don't disagree with Lloyd. I mean, the 9/11 and various things like that were obviously huge parts of my career. But in terms of actually being somewhere on the location, I was in Berlin the weekend the wall came down, November '89, and that was a world-changing moment, and you could feel it. You could feel it on the ground. We didn't know for sure how far this was going to go, but we knew it was huge because our lives had been lived with this wall separating East and West in Europe, and so that was huge. Being in I did a number of war zones. Took the National on the road through Afghanistan and Iraq, and various other places. Lots of like Lloyd did. Lots of like big royal weddings, royal funerals. You name it. All of those things are to actually be there is was always the highlight of my career, and working with amazing people. I mean, they carried me for 50 years and kept that knock on the door from happening of we made a mistake.
Back to the HR thing.
That's right.
They caught up with you. Is it hard, Peter, when you're witnessing something like the Berlin Wall coming down to keep your emotions in check? Because as journalists, you're supposed to be impartial and not show emotion or bias, but you're witnessing this, like you say, life and world changing event. Is it hard to keep everything in check?
Yeah, to a point. So many of these things are not clear in the moment, right? We knew it was big, but we didn't know how big it was. At times it seemed like, okay, is all that's happening here is they're uniting East and West Berlin, or is it uniting East and West Germany, or is it bigger than that even? Is it the end of communism? Well, it eventually led to the end of communism in Eastern Europe, although at times it looks like it's returning. But trying to define that at the time made it easier to keep things in check. 9/11 was tough. I mean, there was no doubt about what had happened.
Yeah.
And you saw it. You saw those planes go into the buildings. And I was on the air, with some slight interruptions for 44 hours. So that was a long time, and your emotions are impacted by the things you're seeing, the things you're hearing. But there is something about, and I'm sure Lloyd talked about this too. There is something about being in the studio. It doesn't make it less real, but it is like you're witnessing it, like the viewer at home is witnessing it. You're
Exactly.
looking at a monitor, right? And so you're trying to make, you know, uh, important comments and relay as much credible information as you can, and be constantly thinking of the appropriate questions to be asking the people that they're shoveling to you every 5 minutes on a line from somewhere, who have something to add to the commentary.
Peter Mansbridge is our guest on Up Close and Personal. Peter, recently Lisa Laflamme of CTV wasn't reporting the news from her usual spot on the anchor desk. She became the news following her unceremonious departure from that network. What was your impression of how that whole situation was handled?
Well, I don't think anybody could say it was handled well. It
No.
was a disaster for everybody involved. It obviously wasn't much fun for Lisa, but for the business interests involved, it was handled so poorly that nobody came out of that a winner. Um, the thing about Lisa, I've known Lisa for a long time, and she's a great journalist, and I have no doubt that she will continue to be a great journalist in whatever path she chooses. And I would find it hard to believe that there aren't more than a few opportunities that exist for her. My only advice to her is to take her time making that decision,
Right.
about what it is that she wants to do going forward, because she's still got so much to offer for those who are clearly big fans of her work. But the country needs people like Lisa Laflamme.
Absolutely. Have you had a chance to speak with her since this all happened? And if so, how's she doing?
Electronically, we've spoken
Good.
back and forth.
The new leader of the federal Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre, is making it his mission to defund the CBC. And whether or not you agree or don't agree with him, is there an argument to be made, Peter, that the CBC shouldn't be in, say, the digital space competing with other media outlets, at least not while being funded to the tune of $1.5 billion from the feds? Does it not seem like an unfair fight?
No, I actually don't think so. I think there's lots to be discussed about the future of the CBC and the CBC mandate, and how well the CBC has actually delivered on its mandate. I think those are all open questions and
Mhm.
should be discussed and debated and challenged on the part of CBC management. On the issue of whether they should be in the digital space or not, listen, the CBC's mandate is to provide information and a sense of the country to all Canadians through every means possible. So those means have changed over time. I mean, when it started, it was just radio. Did anybody say, "Oh, no, no, you can't go into television because that's space reserved for others"?
Right.
No, it's not. It's public space, and so is the digital space. That's the way I feel about it. Um, and clearly, you know, Canadians seem to feel that way about it as well. Is there a debate surrounding the funding of the corporation? There is, and there should be. Anytime there's that amount of money spent by the public purse on anything, there should be a healthy discussion about it. Now, there have been elements of the Conservative Party who, as far back as I can remember, decades, have felt the CBC. First of all, there was no need for the CBC because there were other Canadian networks now. There's a difference, I mean, CBC is mandated to provide Canadian programming. The private channels, CTV Global, are not, and that's fine. Their shareholders want to make a profit, and they make a profit by running American programming, mostly American programming in prime time.
Right.
And that's their right. That's what they do. The CBC. What I've always said about the CBC is that Canadians should be able to sit in front of their television and move from channel to channel And when they hit the CBC, they should know instantly, okay, this is the CBC. This is Canadian. Now, and should like it. Now, you can argue that that is not the case anymore. And that they don't see that distinction when they move through the channels. That's got to happen, or it's a legitimate question to be asked. Why are we spending whatever it is, $1.5 billion a year on the CBC?
Right.
So, I've always been open on that, and I'm a huge hockey fan. I'm a season ticket holder, but I have problem with hockey disrupting totally the CBC channel for no financial reward. It's been years since the CBC made any money off hockey.
Right.
That all goes to Rogers.
Yeah.
All hockey does for CBC is fill its programming schedule.
Yeah.
And help qualify as Canadian content. Well, that's not what we created the CBC for. Anyway, that's a separate argument. I'm a staunch defender of public broadcasting and of the idea of the CBC. And I'm a staunch defender of the journalists who work there, many of whom I worked with, who are dedicated young professionals. And, I have had my differences when I was there and continue to have some of them now with management decisions about the way the CBC's run. But then, I'm not a manager, and I don't envy the difficulties I'm sure many of them have.
So season tickets, I'm assuming that's Leafs, but you're also a staunch Winnipeg Jets fan.
I am. I spent a lot of time in Manitoba, and I was there when the Winnipeg Jets started in the early 70s with Bobby Hull and all that.
Yeah.
So I've had season tickets. I don't at the moment. I've had season tickets for the new Jets as well. But it's only so much back and forth that I can do. So I'm a Leafs fan, for all that means. I mean, I was a Leafs fan as a kid. So when we moved to Canada, I became a Leafs fan almost immediately. We lived in Ottawa, and in those days, the Senators didn't exist, so you had to choose between red or blue, Montreal or Toronto. I chose Toronto. The rest of my family chose Montreal. So there were some interesting times in the house at that point. But no, I'm still a Leafs fan, still believe that somehow it's all going to work.
Man, 1967 seems like a lifetime ago, doesn't it?
It does. But it's all going to change this year, Scott. You got to believe.
Should we start planning the parade now? Or
That's right. That's right. I mean, all those good young men from the Sioux are going to make it happen, right?
Yeah, I'll tell you. It's you look at the Leafs, and it's almost like looking at the Sioux Greyhounds, over a 5 to 7 year period.
Yep.
Peter, you've authored 3 books that you mentioned, 3 best-selling books. You've got the podcast, and you've got a 4th book that you're working on. What is that book about, and any other projects that you're working on?
Yeah, I'm not at liberty yet to tell you what the book's about. I can tell you that it's not about me, which is good. That was last year's book. No, this is more about Canada and Canadians. 2 books ago was Extraordinary Canadians, which were Canadians who had met and succeeded fighting against certain challenges in their life, and it was a very inspiring book. This too will be inspiring on a different level. And I can't really say too much more than that. It's I almost finished it. I'm writing it with my friend Mark Bulgach, who we did Extraordinary Canadians together, and we're almost finished it. We have to deliver it to the publisher probably before Christmas, and we go into the full-scale editing early in the new year, and it'll be available next fall.
Great. Look forward to it. You've interviewed hundreds from all walks of life, Peter. Is there one or two that stands out, and anyone that maybe you wanted to interview but for whatever reason never got the chance to?
Well, I've done 20,000 interviews, so it's hard to say. Well, the one that actually mattered was, there are lots of big names in that list, from Obama and rattle off a bunch of them. But quite frankly, for me, and I don't know how it is for you, but the interviews that are most memorable to me are the ones that aren't with the famous people. They're a great thrill to do. But those who aren't known usually have the best stories to tell. There's no spin. They just tell you what happened. And so whether it was, and they're usually in some kind of difficult situation. I mean, I can, I still look back to 79 when I was kind of operating as a bit of a foreign correspondent in Southeast Asia, covering the exodus of the boat people from Vietnam. Those people were, many of whom ended up in Canada, were extraordinary. Their dedication to getting out of Vietnam and trying to find a better place for their kids to grow up in, whether it was people who had suffered through the tsunami in 2004, the droughts in Africa. I mean, these are all interviews you never forget. You may forget the names of the people, but you never forget their faces or their stories. Who do I wish I'd interviewed? I tried through every connection I had to get Trump, and that didn't happen because it's you can wait by just putting in an application with the press office for whatever president or whomever, and you'll wait likely forever. But if you actually have a connection that's how I got Obama. I had a connection, and I had a connection on Trump, but it didn't work, unfortunately. I mean, he didn't want to spend any of his time talking to a Canadian.
If they came back and said, we can get you Trump and you get one question for him, what would that question have been?
Well, it might have changed over time. I mean,
I bet.
The question I would like to explore with him is, why does he lie so much? And he actually believes it works. So I think he would engage on that issue.
Yeah.
He would just get up and walk away, because he does lie. He lies all the time.
For sure.
And he lies partly because he believes the more you lie, the longer you keep that lie, the more likely it is people will actually start believing it.
Right.
And he's shown that, and he continues to show that today. But first of all, I don't think he's as dumb as a lot of people think he is. I think he's got extremely poor judgment. I think he's a bit of a fraud and a con man, but he's not stupid. And I would like to try and explore some of that area with him. But you know what? I won't be, I'll be getting the knock at the door from the CBC saying, about that pension, we really did make a mistake. That knock will be coming before the one comes from Trump.
13 Gemini Awards, the Order of Canada, and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, just a few of the accolades that have come your way. Peter, when you signed off for the final time, June 30th, 2017, from Ottawa, how hard was that for you? And do you miss the everyday grind of putting together a newscast and a lineup and sitting at the desk?
It wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. I miss it on big days when something big's happening. I miss that. But the podcast has actually made the transition easier, because I still have those. The podcast, you're looking at the podcast right now. This is it. This is where I do it from, either here or in our place in Toronto or Scotland. I sort of have this little built-in studio. And it's me. Like, that's it. My son occasionally helps with the social media postings, but in terms of the editorial direction and production of the show, it's all me. And I have my little, control box, which looks kind of like what I had in Churchill. It's everything but spinning the 45s.
Yep.
And queuing. But, it's fun. So it's demanding in that sense, keeps me engaged. I do all the research. I do everything. I book the guests. I do the whole, I'm not like you, Scott. I don't have like it's huge staff. 20
yes.
or 30 people like you have running around getting everything ready for you.
Or one. A huge staff of one.
Well, that's one more than I got. Anyway, it's fun and I enjoy it.
The only thing you're missing there is some tape and a grease pencil and a razor blade, and it would just be like Churchill.
That's right. That's right.
Peter, you've been a part of the Canadian media landscape for over 5 decades. We've welcomed you into our homes, and you became a part of the fabric that makes up this great country that we call Canada. And I guess we have Gaston Charpentier to thank for going through the Churchill Airport one day back in 1968. We're indebted to him as we are to you. Thank you for doing this today.
Thanks, Scott. I've really enjoyed it.
Scott's wardrobe provided in part by Moores, Sault Ste. Marie.